There's a photograph that I keep returning to. It was probably taken sometime in the 1980s. It's a picture of a living room, wood paneled walls, a carpet of dried mustard, a comically large television set in the corner that doubled as furniture. A family is gathered around it, a man, a woman, two children, while the man still has his work clothes on. And most importantly, they're all, every single one of them, looking at the exact same thing. I don't know what they were watching, but neither do I need to. The interesting part is not the television, it's the faces. They're open, they're present in a way that is almost difficult to look at now, because it is the face of people who are quite simply there. This is the face of someone who is present. This is the face of someone who has nowhere else to be. This is the face of someone who has not yet learned to be elsewhere while they are still being somewhere. That family is gone. They're not dead, not necessarily, no, but they've probably changed, just like all of us. And I think about that picture quite often because it represents something that we lost so completely and so quickly that most of us never really noticed it happening. Well, some of us did. Growing up in a third world country meant we lagged behind the West by about a decade. So while I would not say that I saw it happening, I did not have that sort of an insight yet, I did feel the loss of a quality of a presence. There was a certain weight to an evening which now felt quite light. The specific noise of boredom before it became unacceptable. In 1993, there were approximately 130 sites in the world. 130. You could theoretically read all of them. It would probably take you a week, or if you're someone like me, an evening. You could know the entire internet. It was a place you could comprehend. It was like a village, almost. Strange and new and full of possibility the way a new frontier is, because it was still bounded. It still had edges which were quite tangible. The internet of 1993 was made by people who wanted to be there. You needed a computer, a modem, a phone line which you were willing to tie up for hours. You had to have a willingness to learn commands that felt like incantations typed onto a black screen. There was a lot of friction. Beautiful, now unimaginable friction. Friction meant something. It meant that the people who gathered there were quite curious. They were eccentric, they were deliberate, they were outliers, they were trailblazers. They were seeking something and they happened to find each other. And with this bond, they built something together in the dark. By 2024, there were over 1.1 billion websites. 130 to 1 billion, 100 million websites. In about 30 years, the internet went from a village to an entire civilization, and like most civilizations that grew too fast, unfortunately, it has now grown past its wisdom. The mistake we make when we talk about the internet is that we talk about it as if it's a singular thing. It isn't, it never was, it wasn't ever designed to be singular. The internet of the 90s, the textbooks, the RC channels, that was one thing. It was strange and marvelous and quite exclusive. The internet of the late 90s, the .com boom, the first web browsers, the democratization of email, that was something entirely different. It was exhilarating, it was slightly fraudulent, still possible to believe in. The internet of the early 2000s, forums, blogs, Wikipedia, a growing sense that this might genuinely change how knowledge worked, that was something else entirely. You could still feel in those years that the thing being built was fundamentally good. This was the democratization of knowledge. And then around 2006, 2007, something shifted. Facebook opened to the public, Twitter launched, the iPhone arrived, YouTube was acquired by Google and began its long transformation from a novelty into an entire institution. And something that had been merely a tool became an entire environment. This is the last distinction that I keep coming back to. A tool is something you pick up and you eventually put down. An environment is something you inhabit. You don't use an environment, you live inside it. It shapes the contours of your thinking, the way a room shapes the way you move, the way a city shapes your sense of what is normal. what is possible, and most importantly, what is real. We stopped using the internet somewhere around 2007. Post that, we moved into the internet. I want to talk about the things that we lost. And I don't mean that in a sentimental way, or rather, not only in a sentimental way, but I think we owe it to ourselves to be a bit more specific, to name things, because it is easy to say that something has been lost and sound quite cinematic and let the vagueness of the claim protect us from having to feel it. But I don't want to be protected from it. I want to feel it precisely. So, real boredom, the kind that used to descend on a Sunday afternoon in winter when there was nothing to do and you were told you were too old to invent games and too young to go anywhere else. That particular agony of a long car journey with no music, the waiting room, the queue, the slow hour before dinner when the lights went flat and time seemed to thicken. We eliminated boredom, pulled it out at its roots, and in doing so, we eliminated the conditions under which certain kind of thoughts become possible. Because here is what boredom actually is. It is the mind turning inward. It is the self becoming available to itself in the absence of an external stimulation. In the absence of an external stimulation, the brain does not go quiet. It begins to process. It starts to make connections. Neuroscientists call this the default mode network, a state of inward focused cognition that activates when we are not engaged with the task. It is during this state, research suggests, that we consolidate memory, that we build empathy, generate creative insight, and construct the narrative of who we are. We are not built for constant stimulation. We are built for rhythm, engagement, and rest, signal and silence. For 10,000 years, that rhythm was imposed on us by the world, by seasons and darkness, by the limits of what there was to do. We have discarded the last 10,000 years in the previous 15 years. And now we live in a kind of permanent, low-grade overstimulation, not quite fully engaged, not quite at rest, a kind of neural twilight, scrolling, half attending to an infinite stream of images and words and sounds, none of which demand anything of us, none of which we will remember tomorrow. This is not living. This is something entirely different, something for which we don't have a word yet. Flow can be defined as a condition in which a person is so fully engaged with a challenging task that time itself dissolves, self-consciousness disappears, and performance peaks. Athletes describe it, musicians describe it, surgeons, programmers, chess players, writers. The conditions for flow are quite specific. The task must be difficult enough to require full attention, but not so difficult as to produce anxiety. There must be a clear goal and immediate feedback, and there must be no interruption. Flow is what humans are designed for. It is when we do our best work, and it is where we feel most alive. The internet was in its early days a place where flow was quite achievable. Programming, writing, researching, long-form discussions about philosophy or fiction or code. These were activities that demanded concentration. They had goals, they had feedback, they could carry you somewhere. What the platforms built after 2007, the feeds, the timelines, the autoplay algorithms were specifically, deliberately engineered to prevent flow, because flow doesn't sell advertising, distraction does. I want to be careful here not to be naive. The people who built these systems were not, well, at least not most of them, cartoonish villains. They were engineers and product managers, venture capitalists, who were following incentive structures, optimizing for metrics, solving the problems in front of them, but the cumulative effect of a million small decisions where each one is designed to keep you engaged for slightly longer, to make the scroll slightly more irresistible, to make each notification a bit more urgent. That was a system that is quite literally optimized against human flourishing. In 2017, a former Google design ethicist, Tristan Harris, he testified before the US Senate and said there are a billion people on the other side of that phone, and they have the smartest people in the world figuring out how to keep your attention. A billion people with the smartest people in the world pointed at you. And on the other side, you, tired, maybe a little lonely, looking for something which you can't really name. Unfortunately, this was never really a fair fight, was it? There is a study that I think about quite often. In 2018, researchers at the University of Pennsylvania, they ran an experiment where they took 143 graduates who described themselves as normal social media users and split these people into two groups. One group continued using Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat normally. The other group was limited to 10 minutes per platform per day for 3 weeks. At the end of 3 weeks, the limited group reported significantly lower levels of loneliness and depression. What makes the result significant is not the size of the effect, it is what it implies about the baseline. These were young people in college, surrounded by peers, at one of the most socially rich periods of their entire lives. And the thing making them lonely and depressed, measurably and quantifiably, was the tool they were using to stay connected. This was the very tool they were using to form connections was simultaneously making them feel alone. I've tried to sit with the full weight of that sentence. I'm not really sure I've managed it yet. It feels dramatic, it feels poignant to say out loud, but the weight of that sentence, the fact that the tool that we use to make connections is the reason why we feel so alone. The poet Rainer Maria wrote a letter to a young poet who had sent him his work. The young man wanted to know if his poems were any good, and Rilke's response, which has become one of the most famous pieces of literary correspondence in history, it began with a question. He wrote, "You ask whether your verses are good. You ask me. I've asked others before this. You send them to magazines, you compare them with other poems, and you're upset when certain editors reject your work. Now I beg you to stop doing that sort of a thing." Rilke's advice was to go inward. You ask yourself, must I write? Not whether others would approve, not whether it was good, but whether you must, and whether you would die if you didn't. I think this is the most radical and most necessary advice that can be given to a creative person. It is advice that the internet has made almost impossible to follow, unfortunately, because the internet has given us something that the previous generation of artists and writers and thinkers never had. The internet has given us a real-time audience available at all times, ready to respond. And the human nervous system, which evolved in small social groups where the response of others was survival critical information, it can't resist that. It can't not care. The like, the reply, the share, these are not trivial. They light up the same neural pathways as food and sex and social belonging, because for most of human history, social approval was survival. So we make things now, and we share them immediately. In fact, we are encouraged to do so. We have a thought and we tweet it before it finishes. We have an experience and we photograph it before we have had it. We live now in a constant state of imagined witness, performing our lives for an audience that may or may not be watching, optimizing ourselves for legibility, for shareability, for the version of us that makes sense in 2 seconds of someone else's scroll. And in doing so, we have lost something once again. We have lost the capacity to be alone. That is what Donald Winnicott stated, and he meant something quite specific by this. He didn't mean the ability to be physically alone. He meant the ability to be alone in the presence of another, to be fully unperformed, not shaped by the gaze of others while still being in relationship. It is a capacity that develops in childhood, he argued, through a very specific experience, being alone while a parent is nearby, learning that you don't have to be watched to exist, learning that your inner life is real even when there's no one else to witness it. We're raising a generation, the first generation in human existence, for whom there's never been a moment without a potential audience, who have grown up performing, who have not learned that you can exist without being seen. And I don't know what that does to a person. Not fully, but I don't think the answers will be good regardless.
That is holding up passage of a massive federal spending bill. The hitch seems to be the so-called fairness doctrine.
In 1987, the United States Federal Communications Commission abolished the Fairness Doctrine. The Fairness Doctrine had required that broadcast news present issues of public importance in a way that was honest, equitable, and balanced. It was quite imperfect, as all regulations are, but it rested on a principle that the public airwaves used by private companies for profit had an obligation to the public. Its abolition opened the door for what came after: talk radio, cable news, and eventually social media. A media environment in which there is no longer any requirement to engage with information that challenges you, where an algorithm which is consistently optimizing for engagement will consistently feed you an ever more concentrated version of what you already believe. The business model of every major platform is, at its root, outrage, because outrage is what keeps you on the page. And here we are, and so we have built, without quite meaning to, the most sophisticated confirmation bias machine in human history. This is a machine that learns you. It learns about your fears, your loyalties, a sense of who threatens you, and then holds a mirror up to those fears and says, "Here, look, you are right." And the consequence is that we no longer share a reality. Human societies have had disagreements, have always had factions and camps and competing interests. This isn't new, but what is new is that now we have competing epistemologies, competing ideas, not just about what is right, but about what is real, about what counts as evidence, about who can be trusted to tell you things, and an algorithm which is actively and continuously driving those epistemologies further apart, because division is engagement and engagement is revenue for the shareholders. The philosopher Hannah Arendt wrote in The Shadow of Totalitarianism, argued that the precondition for political catastrophe is the destruction of what she called the common world, a shared space of facts and objects and institutions that make it possible for people who disagree to still argue, to still, at some basic level, be in the same conversation at the very least. We are destroying the common world, not with bombs, but with feeds. I want to be fair. The internet has done some things which are genuinely good. It has given a voice to people who had none. It has made information available to billions who had no access to it. And it has connected people across distances that would have meant permanent separation. It has allowed communities to find each other, communities of the marginalized, the ill, the grieving, the strange, who would otherwise have lived and died in isolation. I owe the internet for some of the best relationships that I have in my life. And these are not small things. I'm not willing to pretend that they are. But I also think that we made a mistake, a civilizational mistake, when we allowed the same systems that do those things to also be the systems that control our attention, shape our preconception of reality, mediate our relationships, and serve the financial interests of a very small number of extremely powerful companies. We allowed the same infrastructure to be both library and the casino, and the house, as we know, always wins.
Based upon the evidence supplied by several highly respected public opinion research organizations, it is apparent that public awareness about the alleged association between smoking and disease probably exceeds that of any major contemporary issue, exceeding 90%. Such a high level of awareness by the public shows the Federal Cigarette Labeling and Advertising Act is working. Therefore, why is it necessary to consider an unproven and complex system of rotating health warnings?
In the summer of 2021, a whistleblower leaked tens and thousands of internal Facebook documents to the Wall Street Journal and the United States Congress. Among them was a slide from an internal research presentation. It was dated 2019, and it read, "We make body image issues worse for 1 in 3 teen girls." This was a sentence written by a Facebook researcher and was presented internally. It was seen by the people whose job it was to make decisions about the platform, and then it was filed away and nothing changed. I have read a great deal about corporate malfeasance in my life, about companies that knowingly harmed people for profit, tobacco companies that had research on cancer, opiate manufacturers who represented their addiction risk, chemical companies that knew their products were poisoning water supplies, but they continued anyway. This is in that category. Except that the product is not a cigarette or a pill, it is just a mirror, an infinite algorithmic mirror, one that learns over time exactly what images make you feel worse about yourself and shows you more of them. The research on adolescent mental health and social media use is, at this point, extensive to say the least, and it is not good. Rates of anxiety and depression among teenagers, particularly teenage girls, began rising sharply around 2012. This is the same year smartphone ownership hit critical mass. This is the same year I got my first smartphone. This is the same year Instagram launched on Android. These are correlations, not really proofs. But these are correlations that appear across multiple countries, multiple researchers, and multiple methodologies. And the direction of that relationship, from platform use to psychological harm, it is supported by experimental evidence. John Twenge, a psychologist at San Diego State University who has studied generational differences for decades, looked at the data and concluded that the generation that came of age with the smartphone, the generation she called iGen or Gen Z, is by every psychological metric we have the most anxious, the most depressed, and the least likely to take risks of any generation she has studied. They have also spent less time with their friends in person than any of the previous generations, and they feel more alone. I want to be careful not to moralize. I don't think the children are weak or the parents are failures or that the problem is that people just aren't trying hard enough. This is the response of people who are not looking clearly at the structure of the problem. The structure of the problem is this. We have given children access at the most vulnerable and formative period of their neurological development to systems that are specifically designed to be maximally engaging to the human brain. And then we have told them to use these systems in moderation. As if moderation was possible, as if the entire architecture of the thing weren't designed to defeat moderation in any form. We gave children cigarettes and then we told them, hey, don't inhale. And then we blamed them for the cancer they eventually got. I do not want to end in despair, not because despair isn't warranted, I think in some measure it is, but rather because despair in this context is a trap. It is a way of allowing the grotesque nature of the problem excuse us from the smaller possible things, from the things that we can actually do. So let me try to be honest about what I believe in. I believe the internet, in its current form, is doing serious and lasting harm to human beings, to our psychology, our attention, and our relationships, but most importantly, our collective capacity to inhabit a shared reality. I believe this harm isn't incidental, but structural. It is built into the business model the same way addiction was built into the business model of the tobacco industry. I believe it is particularly harming to children and that we are failing them by not acting on what we already know. I believe the political consequence of algorithmically amplified tribalism, it's not over, and it's unfortunately probably gonna get a lot worse. And I believe that as individuals, we are mostly powerless against the system. Which is why the conversation about personal responsibility, just use your phone less, buy a dumb phone, while it's not wrong, it's deeply incomplete. You cannot moderate your way out of a system designed to defeat moderation. But I also believe in the particular stubbornness of human beings. Our tendency, even in the worst environments, to find and create small pockets of meaning. I believe in the particular nature of human beings to choose even when choice is constrained. Our ability, when we do pay attention, to notice what we are losing and to reach for what we want instead. There are people building different kinds of platforms right now. There are different models, different incentives, different relationships between the reader and the feed. And they are quite small for now, but it's nice that they do exist. There are researchers and legislators who are paying attention. There are educators who are fighting for something better, regardless of how imperfect and how unsuccessful they are. And then there are individuals, many more than you and I can think of, who are choosing in various ways and at various scales to resist, to turn the phone face down, to let the boredom come, to read a long book and not announce to the world that they read a long book, to have a conversation that goes nowhere and a conversation that doesn't need to go anywhere, to allow themselves the strange and countercultural luxury of an unobserved hour. These aren't solutions, they just aren't enough to be solutions, but this is how a solution starts. They start with the recognition that the noise isn't reality, that the scroll isn't life, It starts with the recognition that the unmonetized, unoptimized, unshareable moments, the conversation that matters, the book that changes you, the afternoon of beautiful, purposeless nothing, those are not marginal things. Those are the main thing. Everything else is just static. I think about that family in the photograph quite often. The man who never took off his work clothes, the children in their pajamas, the woman with her hand resting on the arm of the chair. I think about those evenings spent with your extended family and your mom's brothers, mechanics, friends, where you all play in the backyard and you don't really know anyone's name. You probably won't see them again, but you shared the evening regardless. I don't know if they were happy. I don't know if they talked after the TV went off, or they sat in silence, or they went to bed without saying much of anything. They probably complained about having to clean up after guests had left. Probably all of those things happened on different nights at different scales. But they were in the same room and they shared the same reality. They were looking at the same thing in a world that still had its edges, had its boundaries. We dismantled those boundaries and we have made a world without any walls, without limits, without distance, without the friction that used to force us to be here. Wherever here was, we called it connection, and in some ways it certainly was. But connection without presence is something else. It is the feeling of having many acquaintances, but no one really knows you. It is the sensation of being extremely loud in a very large space where no one can quite hear you. The only person who can hear you is yourself. It is, I think, and this is the deepest wound personally, the loneliness of being permanently available at all times, but rarely ever truly met. We have gone ahead and built the noisiest civilization in human history. And somewhere inside all of that noise, we are all looking for something that's quiet, something that's real, and hopefully something that does not refresh.